Hello everyone, today we comment on Kings and Generals' last video, what everybody gets wrong on feudalism, feudal system crumbling historical model. I have found my ways to make this completely fair use, because last time I read, if anything, the entire script, and that was in theory not licit, but nothing happened. I doubt that Kings and Generals is going to come after me for that. For this video, I will simply essentially criticize at some point I will cite them, of course, but the general context, the rest is all mine, original. It's highly transformative, critical. I'm a PhD in medieval history. I am doing this, yes, for profit, as Kings and Generals does, and they also cite their own sources that are published somewhere. Of course, they're not going to ask for royalties to them. This is wholly legal under fair use law. So I'm proceeding with that. You know that I don't make many video commentaries to begin with, and I actually detest those kind of vloggers, especially those channels that basically have the entire video, like the literal page of the video running with the entire video, and they just comment every 30 seconds of something idiotic that I have to say. Unfortunately, YouTube, self-styled historians, etc., have come to do this, and I say self-styled because, again, we're all self-styled here. We're not providing with diplomas, degrees, and with the whole bull on it, whatever, but mostly apparently high school teachers bailing out of their profession, getting on YouTube, do this stuff. I'm probably the only, better if I don't say what, keeps doing this in parallel with his own professional work. Jokes aside, I'm of course thankful for if anything, the chance that channels like this, Kings and Generals in this case, offer to discuss topics of this kind. Of course, my content is going to be critical, somehow antagonistic. Whenever I prepare these videos, I do so without script or whatever. I always expect this to be much more aggressive and controversial than it actually turns out to be, because these channels are not really simply shooting wrong information to core. There's surely some significant teamwork and research behind Kings and Generals at this point, especially in their history, but I take the chance of commenting on this content, if anything, for the way this is presented, not just for the topic that in and of itself is very big, and it shouldn't, or at least it would be advised not to be treated in 19 minutes, something like feudalism, right? But unfortunately, it's a general context that this content reacts with, that namely people who think to have some kind of primary schooling claiming that terms like Byzantine or feudalism are wrong, and so whoever uses this basically on top of nothing should be like the disqualification of any kind of authority, which is really deep down inside what lesser people psychology is getting down to in today's really day and age. And if you look at the cultural temper, politically, scientifically, morally, it's basically getting down to this, to allow the average person without any kind of better information to presume that listening, for example, to a video like this, or mine, that may be more in-depth, more informed, more extended, is per se satisfactory, just to get some kind of clarity about major historiographical and especially, I would say, historical matters, because this is the first criticism that we can highlight from Kings and Generals. I would say KNG at this point for the sake of brevity. And this is not the first time I encountered this. I don't watch YouTube very much, and I don't watch KNG as basically any other channel really about history specifically that much at all. But sometimes there are these mega videos that receive lots of views and that are very much about topics that, at least as a medievalist, I'm somehow familiar with. And I say, well, it can help Schwerpunkt to talk about this to a broader audience and create a bit of controversy and disagreement, etc., because people like drama as well. So everything that gets heated and emotional, even though that I'm not really that type of person, try to maintain this as sort of fair as possible. Because again, my intention is not smearing KNG or any other channel per se. In the past, I've done something sort of on the lines of joking regarding like some very superficial browsing of different channels on YouTube, etc. And I actually have much broader criticism towards KNG that I will not express here. That is, however, completely normal if you understand what they are doing. Meaning that for me, like my motivation is different from theirs. And for many reasons, again, I will not digress on that. And obviously enough, if we take just historical standards, as I was just saying, you cannot explain a topic like this in 90 minutes. Even though they kind of always structure their video in a way that sort of deals with different aspects at a time and shows that there is truly, as I was saying before, not just a research, but some kind of logical connection between the points that they make. Only, just I think also because of time, they have to narrow this down to a general narrative that fits this limit, and that obviously ends up being somehow overly simplified. What I really criticize, again, is the tone, is the kind of premises behind this, what everybody gets wrong. Okay, that's a sort of clickbait from the title. KNG is very visually entertaining, etc. So I was saying at the beginning, I will not read the entire script per se because I don't need that, but they essentially catch you with this idea. You have basically heard of feudalism, vassals, and lords, and so it ends up that many people may have fallen into some older cliche about what feudalism really was. So first and foremost, as I was saying before, for example, regarding to the term Byzantine, we should make this brief disclaimer, that is to say, certain historiographical terminologies are not made up for some kind of fictional purpose, all right? One cannot say, because the entire point of this video is that until the 1990s, and we will see which study, the concept of feudalism was somehow rigged, right? And after this, it's not like it was dismissed, but it was sort of more nuanced. So, surprise, surprise, this is what normally happens in history. But they're selling you this in a way that makes you think as if, I don't know, major scholars, I don't know, like Kantorowicz, Verbruggen, Duby, Fleury, Tabac, etc., up to 1994, would have not really known what feudalism was. This was just a bunch of imbeciles that somehow believed that was, as it's also extremized at some point in KNG's script, some kind of centralized, heavily hierarchical and direct control of a feudal administration and beneficial elargition that it turned out that never existed. And I would like to make at this point at the beginning of the video, also because I know that lots of people do not have the patience of listening to 2 hours straight, that such vision never existed in historiography. Right, so it's a bit like the straw man that they're trying to put up in this explanation, and of course I understand, for the sake of the general point, that you tend to make rhetorically, dialectically, a contrast, right, between two models to highlight the difference between certain things. But we should be brutally honest about the fact that every medievalist worth of this name in the 20th and the 19th century was perfectly aware of the fact that what we call feudalism, and so even just, for example, the terminology is not properly discussed, not even the etymology of feudalism that derives from probably Germanic, from feud, that it means cattle at the end of the day. That was some kind of, again, what was given in fief eventually, according as a beneficium. By the way, I would tell this to whoever creates the KNG voice. I don't know whether that's probably AI at this point, but the Latin pronunciation is terrible, all right? We're, first of all, talking the Middle Ages, so there is no restitute at this point. The classical pronunciation, debated as it is, I use it myself, that's not the point, pertains to antiquity. If you say beneficium, plural is beneficia, not beneficia or beneficium at singular. Milites, I have heard terrible things. I mean, Latin is that straightforward. What you read, basically you pronounce, and it becomes also kind of easier to a degree for ecclesiastical Latin, what essentially spoke in the Middle Ages. That's important because if you're going to sort of be proper about things, you also should start from these details to a degree. This is not the broader point, but there are many, in fact, aspects under which feudalism could be criticized in here that was not done, especially in a political and institutional sense. They touch a bit on the juridical side of the story, but the video starts with something like, this was not like a feudal pyramid as an overarching system that defined the economic, social, military fabric of the medieval era. Already this phraseology at the beginning makes me think, because why do you have to stress the economic and the social? Right? Can it be the political, for example, the institutional? Why do you want to point it out? I'm a polymologist, so you say military, of course. Most of my videos that I also title at some point feudal for reasons that I don't know whether I'm going to have the time to properly explain today why I use the term. Just made multiple videos in explaining why I use the term Byzantine, just like Byzantinists really do. And also, in fact, King and K&G, let's say better, does not use it to ban the term, right? But even just in a broader history of philosophy history, better, politics, I think, is a bit more central than things like economy, all right? If you want to make the wonderful triad von Clausewitz style, say, politics, warfare, and society, we can agree on something. But the notion that this kind of pseudo kind of winking interpretation to a broader audience that still want to catch the attention of people who are a bit more expert on the topic, they shoot first and foremost the economic side of the story, as you know, for me is a bit let's say it's not what K&G does, but the idea of economic history as a central thing is a bit repulsive to me to begin with, right? So basically, here, another thing they do, just for the sake of convention, I say it because I have my own specific chronological scanning of the Middle Ages. This is somehow subjective, but I go by early, high, and late Middle Ages, which in English, actually in the Anglo-American historiographical mindset, is proper than basically talking here throughout the entire, for example, Carolingian era or up to the feudal monarchies of the 12th or 13th century as the early Middle Ages, is a bit misleading, especially considering that when they get to debunk the concept of feudalism, they start themselves from the 8th century, the Carolingian era, the Carolingian Empire. And so that's really where the High Middle Ages conventionally kick in. In any case, and it's also a bit tricky because they talk a bit about the migration era and late antiquity as well, to point out that, of course, there were clientery, relations also before. This is actually something it's right, I agree with, and I especially do so as I often describe the same ancient world as some kind of feudal system. To me, the Roman Empire can be described as a big feudal system. If you understand by feudal, which is, of course, a transmutation here of an historiographical terminology, a bit as a paradox and a provocation, of course, has to do with, large estates, latifundia, etc., which is actually something we have seen also as far as the migration era videos. Part of the reason why in Frankish Gaul you have the engineering of something that we ended up calling feudalism, given that in this region, great part of the latifundium had not really been destroyed, like, in Italy or in Britain, by some, pretty traumatic events like wars, etc. And did actually allow for that system to be further engineered, even though it had shrunk, it had sort of changed over time, etc. Right? So I see here, because I read from the script, I watched the video today, listened to it while I was preparing other stuff, and I read here in their script that there is this term that is in capital letters, the classical model of feudalism, which I really never heard as sort of capitalized in this sense. I checked it even online because I never really heard of it. Of course, it makes sense in English, but it's not really a thing, right? It never was, as I was saying at the beginning, a classical model of feudalism, whatever it was, right? In our kind of, I can say from my experience, for example, at university, it's just like those guys with master theses that have yet to get into the PhD selection, that share memes on Facebook that say the feudal pyramid was actually wrong, and they don't even know why they're posting that meme. Right? That meme is explained on the basis of things like, I don't know, the Duke of Normandy was more powerful than the Western Frankish king at some point because he was also king of England. And yeah, that's actually the point, because there was actually a hierarchy, right? Kings were more powerful than dukes, and marquises and counts and so on a regular basis. And there is actually hierarchy. There is an actual pyramid. There's an actual source of authority, which is a topic that this video does not actually discuss, right? This video mostly discusses, as we'll see now, a sort of plurality, and we will get to the broader criticism of this, because this is essentially a deconstructionistic video, right? That debunks certain things, and I can even agree with the whole meaning of it, but doesn't build up something else and avoids the bigger topic of this, that is to say that even throughout feudalism, there actually was a namely and recognized public system, right, including the empire, monarchies, a sort of public domain, within which the same vassalatic beneficiary relations there are, for example, that's my term from my sort of continental background. In different countries of Europe, actually, we use different terms, right? I don't know, in Britain, there is the concept of manorialism. The French use seigneur, so, seigneurialism. In Italy, there is the courtly system or whatever. There are all the different options to that. So just also to use the term feudalism here for sort of slamming the term for crucifixion, it should require perhaps a bit more of context, like how, for example, different historiographical schools see this, because this is not touched upon at all, even though there is an addressing of historiography. All right. So they basically present this idea that at the beginning of the 20th century, this ideal classical model of feudalism was developed, and it remained still in university manuals as late as the 1980s. I was technically conceived in the 1980s because, it was 1990, until the +1 year not. I was born actually then after that. But I didn't have the time or the possibility to read at that point university manuals. But I can assure you also from previous studies, etc., that yes, of course, things got refined over time. But we shouldn't, as far as the subject matter is concerned, again, the concept of feudalism was always very fluid and floating and differently interpreted by different historians. On top of an overwhelming amount of stuff, here presenting feudalism as if historians reasoned by some kind of crystallized, simplistic concept applied to the immensity of their research is just per se ridiculous. On the other hand, during the 20th century, there were many different views, of course, at some point also on the concept of feudalism. To some degree, this was understood in less flexible terms. But we should avoid the mistake of presuming that as historiography advances, we have better historians in the process, right? We may have, as we do, actually much more reliable, accurate, even precise information available, but the capacity of scholars to have a comprehensive understanding of the whole has collapsed, right? In the early 20th century, I like to cite that you really could have Kantorovitz that would write things just by knowing the sources, right, without even checking them, and being asked to provide a bibliography by the same university to write masterpieces like Frederick II, right? Historians from the 1990s, as we'll see now, are just better what I don't say what in general, even though some are, pretty credible historians. Besides, I will mention something myself even before I gave you some names. Whose works, if you know them, you already know, never expressed again the concept of feudalism that here is presented. Namely, one that absolutely has not just some of course, not just is rightly presented as in embryonic form, but that is actually validated by some actual historical foundations, and that here in the video is presented instead as some kind of mythology. And it's not really correct. So basically, K&G says there is this, in the 20th century, this idea that in the 8th century, the early Carolingians, especially Pippin the Short, introduced this feudal system. So this vaselage and fiefdoms that we will explain now as they do themselves what this is about, and that this would have been allegedly something, if not new, at least distinct in many ways compared to previous times. They attribute to this kind of strawman idea the fact that it was recognized in this allegedly classical model, the fact that there was something inherited from the Roman Empire, namely the commendatio, that was the topic of one of my very first videos on Schwerpunkt. As well as essentially a Germanic element, a clientary connection. So they explain the etymology of commendatio. This is where they start pronouncing things terribly, like something like "si commendare," with incredibly weird accent. I don't know what they were trying to pronounce there. By even getting the first vowel wrong to begin with. And so to entrust yourself to someone as some kind of clientary connection, all right? And this, the K&J basically says this stuff existed in part from the later Roman Empire. And again, this is something we well know. We knew since, from a really long time. And it was part, in fact, of the same idea, classical element. So this clientary relations, K&G says, were mostly understood. I'm also summarizing from the entire video, mostly in a military sense. All right, it was a great emphasis, especially they say during the 1930s and the 1940s. They do not say it explicitly, but it's as if here we're talking about fascists or Nazis that wanted to stress the military, the religious dimension, a bit what I do for that matter. Regarding that, because it's a sort of, if not leitmotif in the video, but also a matter of just general vision of the era. It's not really somebody's opinion that, especially the Frankish world, the Transalpine dimension, was a heavily militarized society along the patterns of a seigneurial elite that fundamentally developed this clientelary hierarchy mostly for the sake of warfare. Right. This does not mean, of course, that, because this is the point eventually you do, that there isn't just the concept of vassals and senior as far as this military retinues were concerned. They mostly criticize the fact that it wasn't even properly this terminology, the one of vastus and beneficium, right, and senior to a degree. But they say the vassi could be also people who did not have really military obligations. If you really study the Romano-Germanic world as a whole, you realize that more or less this is a militarized system of some sort that paradoxically also works like that, because most of the people's sort of moral and material resources are exhausted, and there is an elite rising from the second half of the 6th century that is the mounted, the armored cavalrymen, so to say, that starts taking on, in fact, those knightly features. In fact, one thing that they seem to align in terms with is the concept that, again, until the 12th, the 13th century, there's not a formalization of what we call feudalism. We'll understand now how and why, but it's a bit like saying that, I don't know, before the lock of nobility in Western Europe in the third quarter of the 12th century, there was not a chivalric code, because we don't have like the epos written down or some codes styled out, right? And that chivalric knightly culture existing from millennia and being, overwhelmingly documented about that under any sort of religious, anthropological, military, social point of view. So it's not like early medieval society was just a desert where there was no resource whatsoever. This is even more the case in the Carolingian Empire. But it's not like there was so much of a great diversion from the idea of the entire system working for providing this mounted elite that could seigneurially protect the system. All right, because clienteles, of course, are born out of that. There is a guy who protects you, and that there's a contract, right? I do something for you, you do something for me. And most of this turns to be like the guys at the top like get resources for defending the rest of the system. We make so many videos and then it's useless even to list them. So the distinction at some point I make in the video between the fact that there weren't just vasi, that were some other terminologies, by the way, doesn't mean too much, right? Terminology, because this is really where it gets down to at some point, does not mean, even though there are in the same documents different kind of clients termed in this way, doesn't mean that the societal role was just some kind of schizophrenic thing, or just it was a vacuum where people were doing something else disconnected from the broader hierarchy, etc. Right? This is a deep problem with today's approach to history in general, mostly coming in fact from the aforementioned socioeconomical understanding of the system, where they try, a bit like this channel, to fit you with the notion that everything is about some kind of structure, because this is paradoxically a structuralistic narrative, right? The same Marxists that began to discuss feudalism that was taught to them by their idealist professors at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, began to draw this much more classistic, rigid, materialistic, deterministic system that paradoxically the later generations of, say, liberals or whatever after World War II in 1968 began to sort of deconstruct, because they were to completely demolish the sense of authority, of elite, of referentiality, and they had to prove you that, there is a hard factual evidence that you can say whether this is wrong and this is right, and, building yourself as a fully developed human being morally, personally, and culturally is basically not the way to actually learn history, to do anything, but you have just to rely on a guy who writes on a paper that he self-sponsors that's the case, and so you have to mechanistically copy what he writes so that other people can take you seriously for what you say, not the quality of what you actually say, but what in some very narrowly self-referential system, very often just ending within the academia of a single country or another, is supposed to be a universal standard. This is unfortunately what a bit our difference between Anglo-Americans and continental Europeans has gotten to, where you understand that the two worlds began at some point to speak different languages. Yes, we, and also literally, of course, to some degree, but I mean really in terms of scopes, of methods, and so on. And so we will understand now better why, because the entire point of this video is, again, that there is this study in 1944 that demolishes the concept of feudalism as we intended it, and it actually even doesn't, right? Because it doesn't demolish, in fact, the concept of feudalism, nor the video addresses the much broader range of implications of having a vassalic beneficiary, whatever you want to call them, seigneurial, whatever, system within, for example, still a world where there was a public universal authority standing, and more, right? Besides, I have lots of videos on the seigneurial era, so if you're interested in that, really made a lot of it, you can check that playlist out, and we'll understand better, or also certain terms that are being used here but not expanded on, right? So the point they make here is, even linguistically, I don't literally understand, because first they say, okay, the strawman idea entailed a Latin and Germanic inheritance from antiquity, and then they say this was, however, a common practice in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. So what? First of all, you call early Middle Ages also the Carolingian world later on. So there is a bit of confusion. Whoever wrote the script may have messed up something a bit, because, again, we will make the final considerations in the end, but in my opinion, these are also relatively crammed, like sort of shrunk scripts, maybe rendered so by the channel, while maybe the guy who wrote this for them had written a more comprehensive sense. Nevertheless, they have AI that can write everything in a polished way. Again, it's even less explainable why they make certain choices in the end. At some point, they even claim that this practice of swearing an oath of allegiance by the warriors towards the leader was something that the Germans during the migration era may have actually adopted from the military oaths. excuse me, but what does it actually mean? It's obvious that the Romans and the Germans were always in contact, that even in the Proto-Indo-European period, we actually find, and this is what they don't say, obviously heavily military and heavily clienterly society where Latin and Germanic languages in fact share the same etymologies of this clienteling system existed since ever, right? You see how structuralistically weird or approximated this concept is. The Germans would have taken it from the Romans. Surely they would have been influenced. They fought with the Romans. They served in the Roman army. But again, did they need to? How do you imagine that Germanic society was before meeting the Roman Empire? People did not know oaths or military clientele or getting something in exchange for that. Because how do you evaluate the beneficium, right? Which stems, as you know, from the Latin, which means to make something good, basically. And so giving them something. If you study, we made lots of videos about the Germanic war bands, also the Italic ones, etc. The concept of redistributing loot after raiding. That is in and of itself a prepaid form of service that the leader entrusts to the follower, who in turn makes this sort of profession of fealty to the leader due to all the metaphysical connection as him as the medium of God, etc. We're not going to digress on that, which is also very well studied and from a long time. Again, this also entire timeline of the 20th century doesn't hold up, frankly, regarding how scholars would have allegedly conceived feudalism in all these oaths of allegiance and beneficium giving and such, right? So even if, what I think they mean here is that even if the Germans had adopted certain specific forms of military oath from the Romans, it's because the Romans were more advanced and more formalized in this practice. But again, is it really relevant to make this point, given also the limited amount of time available? Right. So they say this practice continued after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. And the idea is that this terrible 20th century historians would have understood vassalage mostly in these terms, medieval vassalage in these terms, which again, vassalage is not feudalism. We have to be precise with terminology. Right, they can be synonymous, but again, vassalage is just one part of the deal, of the contract. Feudalism would be this more generalized contractual and clienteling system as a whole. Here, for example, they talk a lot about the about the señores, for example. They don't. Because that would entail, for example, to see how these were connected to public authority. It's not like KNG does not have the capacity or the means to talk about this more thoroughly, right? So that's also my question. Yes, if a person who does not know anything about this watches the video, they will have learned something objectively. It's not like this is such a terrible thing, but in a just mental, conceptual, methodological sense, this is not how you go about. There are people commenting down, "Oh my God, you make such serious analysis. This is so great." You're literally making people believe that this is how we do things in academia. This is how scholars reason. This is how you think people should become expert in things. This is barely something. All right, this is something how you would learn from literally a medieval manual nowadays that everybody can read at 18 and sort of making sense of reality. And I know that most adults still, even by watching these videos, will not even absorb this information because you must, I can tell you, even as a researcher myself, before criticizing a text like this, I have to read it because it's like here 4 pages of words in transcript. So you may be saying lots of different things that are very specifically heavy, right, and must be unpacked a little bit to make sense of them with interdependencies on the text, etc. It's clear, it's understandable, it's just debatable to an extent, right? And so they go on and they say that the older sense of feudalism is mostly developing from the 8th and the 9th century, under this clienteling practice entailing the beneficium, and in particular the so-called Precarium loan, which is a sort of synonym, which, precarius it comes in fact from the same Latin. It means something that it's not meant to last, it's something temporary of sort. Now, meaning what? That the beneficium, they don't say this technically, but since we're looking mostly at the Frankish reality at this point, at least that is the power, this happened pretty much everywhere, right? But the Franks became a bit the paradigm here. They don't discuss this because, of course, they pass to the Carolingian Empire, so this is for most of Western Europe basically intended. Again, in 19 minutes, they have to skip some broader information. To a degree, they did good, but still, here, for example, they returned with this term, the Precarium, right? This was not much of a thing out there. You can find, of course, in scholarship, as it's said later, the one term preferred by this historian or another, there was a wide terminology. Some actually was a bit more firm. It's a bit like saying, I don't know, the mansi, or the hides, right? To a degree, you can say these things could wildly vary. They could be just units of measure, etc. But we're talking about high medieval Europe, right? Again, the society was not so complex for having this being radically different or overly complicatedly developed to disarticulated in so many exceptions as they basically suggest in this video later on. Things were pretty much straightforward. And we know pretty well that aside from what I said before, that is to say that the military clienteles were really and objectively the most important in the broader picture of probably kingdoms, of polities, of institutions. This isn't even beyond the Franks, of course. It's not like the video doesn't say that. But the concept of Precarium, for example, is semantically and even terminologically not particularly useful, because the most straightforward reality of this all is that much of the beneficia that were not granted by literally giving land to someone, but basically recognizing a pregress possession of something that whichever client, a vassal or not, was already in control of. And the video is totally correct in saying that there was a wide variety of contracts. This was done almost ad personam, or at least there was especially if there was a hierarchy where indeed there were leaders who were provided with a control over a certain amount of land. We'll explain later also how public offices worked in this sense, all right? Again, all the reserve, it did not really or literally believe that at some point, I don't know, Pippin the Shorter Right took away land from someone and regave it to his own thugs. Just for in some sense, this happened. I don't know, if you conquer Saxony and you wipe out a part of the nobility and you install some Carolingian lord, you give him literally in beneficium, in that sense, a capacity of settling in a place and taking control. As I always say in my videos about feudalism / seigneurial system, etc., feudalism in this sense never worked in the sense that as the beneficium was absolutely considered as temporary, there was an actual way to dislodge these people from it. All right, so I'm not aware in historiography of any scholar who was a hard supporter or claimant that there was this exchange retake system, if it is part of the myth that you're busting. Obviously enough, it was all a power dynamic based on already existing seigneurial powers on the land that worked through this hierarchical system of leadership and subordination that recognized this beneficia and different ways to exploit them for different purposes, however, mostly getting down to warfare. Because, by the way, very big disclaimer, the Franks literally did nothing but war. I mean, there's no doubt whatsoever that this is, read, Chris Wickham is a very famous author that describes pretty thoroughly, for example, again, I don't like that, but he's a good historian as far as tracing the socio-economical differences of Western countries in Europe during the early Middle Ages and of course describing as connecting this with the political and institutional system that they produced. And it's pretty obvious that the Franks were very different from especially the British and the Italians, because the Spanish had already been taken over by the Arabs. So that those would have been actually similar hadn't the Visigoths fallen to Islam, right? But it's obviously the Franks that from quite a while lead the system in quite an imperial fashion that is heavily and radically based on military clienteles from a very long time, right? So, for example, there was some kind of stereotype that partly overlaps with what KNG is trying to debunk here, that is to say, the Carolingians changed everything, right? Pippin the Short reorganized, he invented cavalry of the heavier type. Basically, all what the Carolingians did, the Merovingians had already done. This is also the current historiographical consensus, and from a long time, actually, way before the 90s, that here are being taken as some kind of watershed for just one study, one monography. And we will see that, of course, under the early Carolingians and later on, that there was a particular acceleration of this system. It's gradual, no doubt, but it's also something that, together with the same Carolingian imperial re-expansion, self-evidently needed a much larger and functional clientelist system devoted to military activity. If you have any experience with Carolingian chronicles at the time, written by the clergy, that is very connected with something that we will be dealing with in a while, exactly to make this point. Literally, when they wrote what happened in a given year in the annals of these chronicles, they pointed out in which year there hadn't been a military campaign. Basically, their mindset was fixed in a very Frankish way that every year there's a military campaign. All right, it's the ABC of the cosmological order. The only news worth sort of stressing in that sense is in which year there has not been a military expedition. Nobody in Europe did this, especially with the type of heavy cavalry that had been engineered by the broader Romano-Germanic world, but that was becoming increasingly professional in the Frankish world because of the vast estates that were concentrated ever in greater hands, and therefore sort of hands of people who could be isolated a bit more as specific clients. Absolutely at different types, at different points, but that, make this thing heading towards what we more characteristically, stereotypically, whatever you want, but what we call feudalism. All right, you can call it whatever you want, but you cannot erase the mechanism behind that. All right, this is not even what KNG is particularly doing, but again, stressing the fact that there was an historiography in the 20th century just thought that, the Franks were just giving land to someone in exchange of military service ex novo, and that this would be the point of it all, whereas this thing, which is not discussed here, was given to people who mostly already had that power. Is it really a point worth making a video on? So, you know what, again, the beneficium is where it derives from. Here the video doesn't say it, but the reason why you don't have an ownership right on the beneficium is that in theory, everything since Clovis, within the kingdom of the Franks and in its subordinated, foreign subjects, belongs in theory to the king personally, which overlaps with in parallel, given the Roman legacy, with the idea of public domain, which in fact was there even in conceptually, at least in this post-Roman world under Germanic rule. Let's not digress on what in Central Europe they believed or they did, also because we know relatively less, but it's not that difficult even to find out. We will partly talk about this later. They claim that the classical idea of feudalism entailed that at some point the Carolingians began more to give land, as they didn't do, they would say their predecessors would have not done this before, as if the commendatio was also not some form of clientelage that did entail some form of also military activity, not only, right, but still had, especially in Gaul, a marked direction towards some kind of seigneurial lifestyle, mostly aiming at dominating territory and so on, right? So absolutely, in the 8th century, there's a revival of military activity, there's a re-expansion of the Carolingian Empire, and as we've seen in different videos, there is also an increased importance of cavalry appearing. There is some general historiographical debate regarding the fact that still infantry was important, in the sense that there were many militias from an era where there was less surplus and therefore less elite. Mostly we see that it's the 9th century, the second invasions, the collapse of the Carolingian system that brings to a new crisis, and so the need of people to request the protection of this higher guys that become in turn more powerful. This happened all through a contractual system, but there is also no doubt that, I'd say, since the 6th century in particular, the military character of clienteles was quite pronounced all over Western Europe, right? And that even though there were other types of clienteling services entailed by these relations, in many ways, it sort of got down to that, right? This is what they kind of don't want to say, because they want to eventually make the point there was a wide variety of vassalic beneficiary or simply beneficiary connections, and that the terminology doesn't even talk about this specifically, so who knows what there actually was. Again, society was not that complex, and we have a pretty concrete idea of how straightforward and brutal this world actually was. It is, however, still recognized that cavalry increased in importance. This is what, again, they are attributing to the strawman argument. We still believe this today. I don't know of any historian that basically claims that, I don't know, during the second invasions, cavalry did not become more important. It was not even due to the enemies per se. It was just due to the collapse of public authority, to the gradual erosion of the freemen's liberty. Again, these are very well established historiographical topics. Think about the Stellinger Revolt. Think about, I made videos, for example, about the increase in ecclesiastical clientele's power in Carolingian Italy. We talked in general a lot about post-Carolingian Europe in particular, but also the same Carolingian system, right? That this practice was intensified, as they're here sort of criticizing in some way, is there isn't much to say against, all right? We see it even just in the measure in which the Carolingians take over other countries out there, in Saxony, in Italy, etc. Like, there is probably a greater elite, some more powerful clienteles that control more land at a time. They're much more militarized in that elite direction. It's a bit like, I don't know, what will happen in England or in southern Italy with the Norman conquest, right? It's there in those moments of fracture that you can really measure how truly of a thing this military clientele really was. So they point out for the 8th century that there was this older theory where Charles Martel would at some point taken over church land in his, basically the Carolingian, the Pepinid Alnor things came from Austrasia. They fought their war. I also made a video about the Battle of Tortue, and they take over Neustria. It was really the beating heart of Frankish power. And they take over some other parts. They sort of bring a new order, right, at the expense of the Merovingian sovereigns. That is mostly designed to favor, of course, the Carolingian clienteles, mostly from a military point of view. They, on KNG, they basically claim that there is this theory whereby Charles Martel would have taken over church land, and in the process, and that Pippin the Younger and Carloman, his sons, at some point would have restored us to the church, but in exchange, basically leaving their own military clients on this church lands and obliging the church to provide military service to these guys that became sort of their own vassals, as the church has its own immunities and behaves a bit in a different way. And later, as we made multiple videos on Schwerpunkt, the Carolingians properly tried to create a state through the church, because north of the Alps there wasn't much of a public authority. It was all very much private and personal in nature. And basically, the channel said, the video says that this never kind of happened. All right, that there is also later on with the studies of Susan Reynolds that there wasn't such dynamic ever happening. Now, this dynamic actually did happen in the measure, the thing of the switch that they said that Charles Martel created, or his sons made a trick. They tricked the church in forcing them into the... Of course, that is some sort of strange idea. Honestly, I had never heard it in a scholarly sense. But we know pretty well that Charles Martel was, regardless of his victory over the Arabs, through his conquest of Aquitaine, and also before that, by not helping the Aquitanians against the Arabs and weakening the latter, that's also the great genius there. He reconquered an enormous amount of land, especially in central and southern Gaul, that historically had a very powerful episcopal leadership. These were essentially the descendants of the Gallo-Roman senators that at large had turned to bishops and largely living in the same seigneurial but not knightly fashion. And many of these guys had actually usurped during the Merovingian crisis, especially during the course of the 7th century, much land that had, in theory, as we've said, belonged to the Merovingian sacred dynasty. And in which form? Exactly through this kind of vassalic beneficiary system, even though the terminology, we're not going to discuss this, was not there. It's not important. It's the same exact dynamic to some degree. The one of extending your power over some groups that become dependent on you and that have basically to serve you in exchange for your own protection. And so this is the circle that goes on. That had always been a thing, also in the tribal world, as we've seen also before. And Charles Martel arrives in this area and he triggers violently this episcopal estate, right? It's not like the little priest that is trying to survive working his backyard garden with vegetables. No, this is a powerful, massively powerful elite on which, frankly, the same, and very frankly, in this sense, ethnically, the same Carolingians will have to rest on. I made a video explaining also how after Tertri, it was mostly like the ecclesiastical institutions, especially monasteries at some point, that really helped the Carolingians maintaining control, especially in the West. But that write in the Chronicles very negative things about Charles Martel, because he had really infringed upon a custom that, by the way, also in later feudal society, as you know, will become essentially a bit like the gold standard for claiming some kind of older, for example, a laudal power, right? Some kind of private property that couldn't be touched in theory. Or at least better in practice, even by the king or the emperor, because this really belonged to the person who had owned it in a way or another through the centuries, which is not like the guy had purchased it the day before. These were, again, literal fortified emplacements, overlording some broader estates and expanses, and we're talking wide areas, like especially in Gaul, like even small lords had really a lot of land of this kind. And so what basically Charles Martel does is that he arrives with very bloody effective military force and political support, and he's able to broker a deal with this ecclesiastical clienteles, whose power is going to be a bit reduced because they're not so actually warlike like laymen, and that have to provide their own military retinues to the king. For example, during military expeditions during the Carolingian Empire, we have many beautiful examples of abbots, of bishops that have to lead their own troops, if anything, up to the front, and then maybe they can come back home, but they will also fight and die. Think about Neithard, right? Also Charlemagne's blood in that case, being as also technically clergyman at the head of powerful military contingents. This is absolutely straightforward absolutely normal business for gold. It had been always like that since late antiquity, and the Franks sort of doubled down on that and or sort of intensified the system to a degree because, again, this seigneurial power, when especially unchecked by the waning of some broader public authority, expanded on this basis. So aside from this idea of Pippin the Younger and Carloman, etc., it is a very well-established historiographical dynamic, and I wouldn't cross this out as they claim. There's no evidence for any of this having happened. This is straightforward, basic European history of era. I don't know how to point it out. In any case, the rest is pretty straightforward. It was evident that the Vasi couldn't simply be dislodged from the land that you sort of gave them. Again, the best definition is a sort of credit card. Like, I give you this land, you have the right to settle in there or to rule it from there because of this periodic wave of royal or imperial authority revival. But in exchange, you have to give me something because I have enough pressure to force you to do that. Not just I can oblige you to do so, but I will also give you an incentive, a bait, as long as, for example, the Carolingian Empire conquers other peoples and you, through your clienteles, our connections, can exchange favors, in your case, getting more land and people to rule on behalf of the king and whatever, right? And this is what I always point out, that there wasn't a single moment, for example, in post-Carolingian Europe, where somebody said, okay, well, the Carolingian Empire ended, let's go back to the previous system. Absolutely not. Kingdoms remained, the empire remained. There was a straightforward awareness and reliance on public authority that was also the basis that over which and through which seigneurial authority was vassalatically validated, right? The king was the guy who had the ultimate public authority to fully and legally grant you a benefit of a title. We'll see now how or why, because the video goes on along that pattern, right? Then they say another thing. This is still the strawman part. So they basically stressed that in the 20th century, they simply thought that this system was invented by Charles Martel, by Pippin the Short, wherever. And then it took over, and before it kind of didn't exist, even though they said, even in the strawman part, that it kind of existed also before. So again, a bit of confusion at the beginning. But they're pushing for essentially picturing the idea that at some point there were scholars who believed that the Carolingians simply invented a clientary system out of nothing, while the entire world worked exclusively through clientary systems, and mostly also in France, in Gaul, in that military fashion. And they say this at some point, I cite directly. Furthermore, it was also thought that, so by the strawman argument, that many offices such as bishoprics, duchess, so dukes and counts, were bound to the king in this way as vassals. This other statement, I think, is very eloquent, because if you know just a bit of how Frankish society really worked, and also how just in Carolingian times, also in the 9th and the 10th century, you don't have to arrive to the 12th or the 13th, as the video basically claims later. The overlapping of public authority and these private connections was the normality, all right? It's not like it was exactly the same thing. As I said before, public authority was one thing, and the vassalatic one was another. In fact, there should be this fundamental distinction that here they don't also make openly, that there were public offices, but the vassalatic connections, at least when called more or less through that term, were something that existed in parallel to it. They could overlap, but you could be just a king's friend and receiving some lordship, right? This is how, for example, lordships come about in Europe during, especially that seminal moment of the 10th century. And you can't say that was invented later. You have public districts before this time, during the Romano-Germanic era, that mostly corresponded to the older districts, right? There were I don't know, the Celtic oppidum once back in the day populated by that tribe, and then the Romans arrived. They refound the city over that. It is the district, and it works in the Carolingian era on the basis of the bishop and the count ruling that. All of Europe basically was like this, all right? It worked straightforward according to the Roman model, the ecclesiastical administration in the same way. The Carolingians take great care of that also by rebounding the Merovingian very strong contacts with the papacy. Up to Britain, it works all like this, right? On top of this, however, these public districts that keep sort of existing, especially as the cities, and we talked about this a lot in the series about regional, historical regional videos. There are some seigneuries that expand as kind of blobs, right? My last video commentary about king in general was about why was Germany so divided in the Middle Ages, something along that pattern. Imagine the map of Germany, again, in the 13th century. You have a pretty graphic idea of how, even though Germany had been structured in the same identical way, counties with bishops and with dioceses in them, and so how it regularly worked in the Carolingian Empire. Not just other repartitions like marques that, for example, conglomerated more counties or duchies that were this super sort of structure over mostly based on some broader ethnic divisions. But there were actual seigneuries created in private ways that were, however, also sanctioned and recognized as such by public authority. All right, so that's where feudalism gets messy. But you can't say, first of all, that this does not exist, because these relations existed. They were the reason why this system was formed, and so irregularly in a way, and why it was so mainstream, all right, and why the major powers and principalities in Europe stemmed from this. Basically, all the most famous dynasties in Europe stemmed from this mechanism, which is heavily dynastic over time, and thus are actually framed within a hierarchical system. Don't call it a pyramid. That's just a schematism to teach kids in school how the concept works. But you don't find a count that is more powerful than a king. All right. So also in terms of hierarchy, there is a very specific set of layers of power. All right. Counts are not more powerful than dukes in general. And this, of course, there can be a floating of things, but that set of the feudal hierarchy that will remain until, say, the Ancien regime existed historically, was born at this time. It can't be sort of denied, right? It wasn't invented later. And also, actually, the worst argument to make here is that since the term is not there, didn't mean the same. It doesn't mean much. Again, if you're aware of how a system, ratios of power worked in very strictly political, not some abstract socio-economical guess, basic political military history in post-Carolingian Europe, you know how to identify all those little polities and knowing how they were built from the bottom up in the same way. That's why I created the regional series. And what is fascinating about this is that all over post-Carolingian Europe, things work pretty much in the same way, everywhere, right? Even when the system was not solidly sort of controlled by a public authority, there was, however, still always there. So saying things like bishoprics, dukes, counts were bound to the king were not, essentially, because that was a strawman argument, was not bound to the king in the same way as vassals, is correct in the sense that this vassalic beneficiary thing had not been fully institutionalized to equate any kind of public authority, and in fact even survived the feudal era along that pattern, with the further power concentration of monarchies and the later states and so on. But in many ways they worked in the same way, and this is really the thing that counts the most, right? It's not really how this stuff was called, right? It is how this stuff actually worked, all right? It was largely all about military clienteles. Yes, it is true, bishops mostly ruled from cities, and as such they controlled mostly some kind of city militia that is not like a rural aristocracy. But I made plenty of videos on this, like literally have hundreds of videos on these topics. There are all the divides. Again, the duchy is something that normally controls all the various counts that exist in that. The king still controls the Duchy's interior. Again, there can be very powerful princes and all along the same kings. Think about the Capetians of Ile-de-France at some point are as powerful as some other princes, but still, again, public authority is very well rounded up already in political institutional profiles by the 10th, the 11th century. So in a concretely recognizable and expandable way. So again, this notion that, again, vassalic terminology and contracts would have been all pervasive at a public level is, of course, not true, because those are two separated things. But the way the system worked, and so this big military and social clientele, was the only way the system had always been working. There is no doubt that, especially the 10th century, is the moment of greatest consolidation of the system as such, right? And so they say here that at some point scholars believed that the entire system was founded by the Carolingians as a straightforward interconnection between personal loyalty between lords and vassals based on land grants in turn. Again, formally, institutionally, no. Concretely, factually, kind of. Right, and it was not invented by the Carolingians. This is true. The Carolingians, in their couple of centuries of rule, sort of greatly enhanced this. Also because the system needs it in a more efficient and effective way. Because let's be honest, a large part of this mechanism is also consensual. Right, it's not just like one terrible guy that comes to rule over peasants. There is an actual cooperation between the two, and it's very effective at the end of the day. I mean, the great medieval civilization that we intend in many ways to have been feudal largely stems from this. All right. The other only big criticism that I could make that I was told, at least at university, could make towards feudalism is that, for example, at the peak of it, say the 13th century, still there were city-states. We often talk, for example, about Italian communes, but it is also, aside from the fact that these were framed within the Holy Roman Empire, and so there was always a hierarchy. Milan itself would become a duchy later on, literally wanting to be part of the feudal hierarchy and so on. These guys thought to be imperial subjects. We've seen how, I don't know, in some places there were money thieves, so it was not just all about land, but roughly, the system looks pretty similar all over the place. Wanting to make too much distinction, especially in something that does not revolve around the general wealth, advancement of, say, power availability. I mean, there are wide differences across Europe in that regard. Do not mean that there is such a formally different system in and of itself. There is at least a truly overarching traditional idea of imperial power where all these units fall into some corporative, hierarchical, and in this sense also partly clientery way. You don't want to call it feudal? Absolutely fine. That may be a too forced term. I mean, everything ending in ism is forced. Like, we don't really need a medieval history lesson to explain that feudalism is really a conventional terminology. This is absolutely correct. If the point of K&J was to say this, I think they could have said it more straightforwardly. This is more like a convention, and it's not like, again, there were some idiots throughout all the 20th century that had to wait for a book in 1994 to explain them what feudalism really was. This was really insulting towards academia, towards the general accomplishment of people who knew feudal history much better than Reynolds, right? That is the author of that book. Again, we're not blaming Reynolds for this. We're sort of blaming the narrative here that everything would have been debunked at that point just because of what terminology. Typical 1990 mentality by nothing to be surprised of. Also, they think they can't get away with this. So basically, the strawman argument is that the Carolingians introduced this effective system, and it's only when things became dynastic that everything was lost, and the hereditary nature brought the mutation of the feudal system. This is incorrect in a chronological sense. It is true, as we were just saying, that the Carolingians at some point lost control on the system. Not because it became hereditary, but because, of course, they didn't have any means, like in any other ruler had in previous this context to control people they granted this land control to. Otherwise, they would have done it themselves, right? They would have done it through a direct control with a centralized system. Nobody had the capacity to do so. This was the only way any system could work at the time. All right. If you look at the Byzantine pronoia or the edicta in the Arab world, they're less private and sort of paradoxically less developed than the same feudal system in the West. It will paradoxically become more of a glue in terms of state building than in those civilizations. But they say here, admittedly, that the feudal system mutated at that point. Yes, but it's basically the same thing. I wouldn't even point out a shift here. It is true that the Carolingians are very powerful at some point, that a system overall does work along that pattern, mostly because the military clienteles had somewhere to conquer and to grab still. Right? So it's not much like becoming hereditary nature, which in the mindset of this counts mostly the thing really was to begin with, just by traditional genetic claims and selection in their view. This was known very well. Otherwise, the Carolingians themselves would have not tried all their best to create some sort of ecclesiastical state that was not inheritable and so on. So admittedly, things change, but again, that is paradoxically the moment in which the feudal system actually kicked in. Right, and historians from the 20th century knew that pretty well as well. As I said, it's the 10th century more than else that creates some kind of presupposition for really talking about something looking the apotheosis, or at least the foundational cornerstone of what we call the feudal system in a broader sense. So then they passed to Susan Reynolds and the critique of feudalism through the monograph of Fiefs and Vassals, the medieval evidence reinterpreted. So these are typical Anglo-American. She was a British historian. She passed away a few years ago. Of course, it was an important loss, and she released this work in 1994. And as K&G illustrates, even probably in some sort of redacted fashion, is simply that she made mostly a terminological inquiry, and she said basically most sources of the time do not talk about the vassi, or so therefore this vassalatic system, like the term fief of beneficium, they do not appear that frequently, and when they do, they often don't speak of that kind of military clientele or whatever. Now, admittedly, again, first of all, documenting historical realities of that time is somehow complex. And I personally don't make history by going around entire centuries and sort of pretending to cover them, let's say, the entire evidence of how often we find in the sources that terminology. Like, it's not wrong in and of itself. Everybody would like to answer that question in a straightforward way. But there are huge methodological issues, and even if, again, we don't find that lord-vassal relationship as institutionalized, and this I have absolutely no qualm with Reynolds in this, still, as I was saying before, it doesn't mean that the overarching nature of seigneurial Europe at that point is truly that military clientele that is becoming ever stronger and stronger, right? So, again, Reynolds' point, here I'm basically reading from K&G, like as far as they say, they even go as far as saying that, for example, vassim beneficia are terms to be found in the 6th century. So that is not much like a counter-argument, but I mean, if these terms are not so used, they do not mean that in particular. Well, at least the fact that you found them even before still means some kind of continuity and importance of some sort. The point here they make, by also attributing it to Reynolds, is that these terms are relatively ambiguous. So actually they gravitate a bit too much around the point, in my opinion, simply saying that we can't say that was feudalism because there was no terminology mostly fitting the sort of the basic words that we use to define the idea of vassals and lords of something like that. does it change how 10th century Europe actually was? I'm a military historian, right? I study every single polity in Europe at the time, and I observed the degree of militarization of society, how they thought, what kind of anthropological dimension there is connected to also spiritual beliefs, holy war, etc. I know that many people think that holy war was invented by the Crusades. So again, if we are at that level of, I was told so because that's the convention that people in the 90s believed as straightforward, sort of so-called mainstream history. There is a few that I can do. In the 20th century at large, they did not believe that. It's only a very narrow, almost postmodern kind of way of looking at history, mostly heavily influenced by some materialistic and structuralistic view that was especially straightforwardly anti-religious, also sort of polemological in a given time of peak of what had followed since 1968 in certain particular academies, especially in the Anglo-American world, and also in continental Europe, but still, all right? If we're talking real history, that's a completely different story, all right? Real scholarship, monument men, so to say, of the previous generations, that had they been still alive, in some cases, they would have laughed at this stuff, and in part they sort of did. They ignored the extremes of all of this, right? So here, for example, they say, if we find terms as fideles, confidante homines, and milites, because confidantes would be here, for example, because the transcript is based on the audio, and so here they also transcribe, in fact, the very weird way in which milites, which is a very straightforward term, was pronounced in a very weird sense, like milities or whatever. So just whoever did this, again, unless it was AI, they have no clue of medieval sources whatsoever and Latin whatsoever. So it's a bit difficult to study the vassalic beneficiary system in that way. What does it mean? Yes, these are varied terms, all right? As a medievalist, like in a basic way, is this a problem whatsoever? Like it's completely normal. As they said at the beginning, there are different ways, different customs, different terminologies in different communities. That they claim here that feudalism as a concept we would have not considered. There may have been at some point a more broadly unifying approximation on, say, feudalism worked like this, and then maybe, I don't know, we know in Germany worked in a way, in Italy worked in another. It's mostly a matter of degree. And yes, terms may change also on a regional basis, but did the system actually differ that much in the foundations? Really, no. Also, we made videos about, for example, the terminology of all the various... I don't remember the name of the video, but if you go, it's one of those about the Romano-Germanic military system, literally titled like this. There are plenty of names deriving also from different dialects of, for example, of Germanic languages. Say, the Longobard Gazindius is not to be found among the Gallic Antrustiones, right? There are sometimes more Latin influences in places like France than in Italy, depending on the situation. So again, does it change much? Right? Not too much. All right. I remember once I had a discussion with my tutor, who was a dear friend, and she followed me throughout the entire path from the bachelor thesis to the doctorate. And once I said, basically also Longobard society and the ones, the Anglo-Saxons, etc., were gradually heading in the bigger scheme of things towards a more vassalic direction, right? And since she was very, very straightforward in stressing the difference between such, basically any society, but with the one of the Franks, she said no. But she didn't understand, of course, that it was a broader pattern of privatization that we witness happening throughout all the High Middle Ages. It's like, I don't know, even in the Slavic world beyond any Frankish or influence, we know that elites increased in power during the High Middle Ages, that cavalry, heavier cavalry elite increased in force on the battlefield. It's all pretty straightforward in many ways. And of course, there was a Frankish influence even beyond the territories that they conquered, right? We know it in military history, right? The increase of, again, of nightly shock combat, collective training, etc. It's pretty straightforwardly there, and you know perfectly well why this was occurring across the entire Europe. I mean, by the 14th century, if you look at from Portugal to Lithuania, from Norway to Sicily, it's always the same picture. Basically, the men at arms are all the same. They all look, in many ways, the same at that point. It was a process of great amalgamation, deriving mostly from this privatistic, what ended up becoming Ancien Regime standard. So again, nothing so strange, and if you don't want to call it feudalism, even though here, as also King in general says, it's by that point it had been more codified, and there is an actually feudal law that starts being studied, etc. So it's not something that they simply made up, right? If that had not existed, they would have not even talked about it. And more to that, because as you know, I also made a lot of content about history of law where we discussed those very things, and you can't really see in the older Germanic codes in Romano-Germanic Europe that there was a tendency of the later societies toward that kind of aristocratization. This is not just the Franks, in parallel with the development of heavier cavalry shock combat. So what do these terms mean, right? Fideles, confidantes, homines, milites. Sometimes it's just literally a literary, linguistic choice. It's not even an institutional thing. It's maybe in the same place, a different author who wrote this stuff in a different way. Doesn't mean that it had to be part of a uniform vassalatic terminology or category. Absolutely not. But nobody really ever thought of this. I mean, all this terminology was pretty straightforwardly known ever since medievalistics studied the laws of the Romano-Germanic peoples, same later feudal law. It's not like they applied, they forced on, also because there are relatively few sources as well, and they're relatively straightforward. There are some important semantic shades that you must interpret. That this video basically does not distinguish between these. They say basically, no, this is just ambiguous. Reynolds say it, so you cannot say that there was something more. What does terminology have to do in a world that is not ruled by a single polity that does speak different languages across different countries? Even in the use of the same Latin, they are going to differ in that way. However, the fact is this was overall, a relatively homogeneous system, and it was definitely run by some kind of more intensified military clientele based on ever more aristocratic elite control. That's mostly what we think of when we discuss feudalism. Was there anyone who needed to push this? I mean, it's a big thing. Like, this is not like an era of Europe that at some point was mischaracterized beyond comprehension, as if, I don't know, medievalists had never kind of wanted to see what this was, or had come especially to the concept of feudalism in a broadly approximate term, just to define something that they in fact could find beyond these kind of differences. What a surprise. In the 1990s, somebody comes up and says, no, we cannot say this because look, here differs, so now we have to destroy all the schemes. Again, I don't want to mischaracterize Reynolds, that again also recently passed away. That's not the point, but this is the message that is passed by the video, all right, is we don't know, right? If, again, the video had been about, let's debunk a bit what people may think feudalism was like, and let's make it a sort of, at least let's explain how it actually was instead, I would understand it. But this, unfortunately, reflects the broader temporal times in which we want to debunk myths, as also they say in the end. We will make more videos about the most common misconception. This is the most triggering word of the misconception. As if people were capable to conceive anything historical to begin with. Like, let's start from the radical mass illiteracy and underschooling, lack of parenting, radical ignorance as the sole identity of the average person nowadays. Maybe that is more interesting. Let's actually teach them something that they can rely on. This is like the Hoplitic heresy. In every video that I discussed about the Hoplitic heresy, like if you have studied classical Hellenic sources about their own warfare, you can do without the Hoplitic heresy and its debunking. And its debunking is even more obnoxious to begin with, because this was just some kind of mental jerk-off that somebody in some academy decided to make as if the entire world gravitated around it, nobody gave a damn about it, and then somebody else came later debunking it and becoming, look, we are the heroes because we are debunking. There is not this. I don't know how to explain it. If you have an idea of what mediavistics is, historically, traditionally, academically, this strawman argument is some kind of excess, at most, of extremization, of actual mischaracterization along the most sort of extreme pattern that does not fit what, if anything, even any scholar has a different idea of feudalism. There isn't, like, how do you think that the academia works like that? There is a guy who writes one thing and everybody repeats that? That's not how it works, all right? Some people do that, and they're rightly criticized, but the inactability of some kind of standard control of idea of how one model is believed for something so big as feudalism that touches on so many different fields. This is not just about, again, this is politics, institution, law, warfare, society, economics, literature. It's beyond so much stuff. There isn't a single model ever capable of imposing itself, right? If not by some standard that eminently tells us, was this an eminently aristocratically dominated system? Yes. Was this based on large feudal estates run by people who spent their life fighting on horseback in heavily armored? Yeah. Was there here a moment of public deterioration? Was a very much private system? Yeah. Like we know this. We know this also from other systems. This is not unique to Europe. All right, this kind of thinking that, again, feudalism is more than just out of conventions. People were taking things too seriously. It's just like the term Byzantine. You have people who come up to have to explain to you that Byzantine is wrong, while Byzantinists themselves still use it. And of course, they know 1,000 times more of any person who makes this kind of points that haven't even opened a Byzantine history manual in their entire lives. We should move away from this kind of mentality. We should not encourage it, right? This video, in my opinion, does not help in that regard, right? Here it criticizes the connection between lord and vassal, or beneficium in explicit terms. Again, say the thing that we said before, that in the 1930s and 40s there was more attention mostly to the military dimension. Even if that had been an ideological bias of Nazi fascism at some point, it's not wrong in strictly military terms. This was a militarized class. Like the 10th century is the moment in which knights all across post-Carolingian Europe can recognize each other on the basis of their military profession across the Alps, across languages, boundaries, because they live in the same lifestyle. There's a process of dynastization. There's a process properly of rigid social separation, say, to some extent, compared to the previous centuries, of more rigid social separation. This also increases later, but it's the same thing already happening now. So just because, as we'll see now, it was later codified, and at this point they didn't need to do so, or maybe they did, but we also have less sources to begin with. What's the point of debunking the notion that there is a conventional term that effectively describes this? And yeah, feudalism is kind of right. Even if you have to, again, use any ism per se. I use always the term feudal for expressing some kind of broader concept, just like Byzantine, that contains in itself the notion that the Byzantines called themselves Romans in their own particular way or different times, not even always in the way we intend. They switch titles often. We talked about this recently in some other videos, but for the sake of the general argument, again, this denial, this iconoclasm, this destruction of the concept of feudalism does not even pass from the strongest points that could mostly rely on not misnomers, but a more fluid system, a less institutionalized, fixed. There are ways to criticize feudalism, and this is not really quite what basically anyone was ever particularly fixated on to begin with. Again, regional interpretations, which again could be here. It keeps talking about the etymology, terminology, etc. Mostly starting from Reynolds' studies. They denied that Charles Martel basically did ever anything. He didn't confiscate any church property, or at least they say it's not proven. There are certain things that are so plausibly obvious in the dynamics of the era for all the rest that we know that they don't need an explicit evidence for being true. It's not like we can't say that, just making it up, but there actually is a pretty straightforward evidence of the fact that Charles Martel went at war with those bishops in areas that began to resent of this Frankish reactivation, of the fact that these places had been normally dominated by the church. It's so obvious. It's well documented. So again, this is more some kind of, again, iconoclasm, when not of ignorance of some sort. I understand that we should smoothen definitions sometimes, that we can't be fully certain about certain things, in particular as specific historic events. But the general dynamics, they're relatively effective. Here to say that the Precarium loan contracts are mentioned in a synod held in 743-44 in Estin. It is also badly pronounced by the AI there. And this happened only once, right? This is only when we see most of these contracts named. Well, I don't know, this is 8th century, first half of the 8th century goal. How many sources do you want to find that specifically refer to this? There are many capitularies in Carolingian history that show how complicated, but also relatively stereotyped certain relations were under certain approximated terms, etc. That sometimes change. That sometimes maybe just out of a semantic shift make you understand how more or less grip the kings had on their vasi. If you don't find the term, that you will find something else, but still, right? Here it says that these Precarium loans in the synods being for church property had to keep warriors for a limited period of time. Well, yeah, it could be a moment of emergency. These guys had to do so. But you understand that the concept is somehow there. And this is just because of the Precarium, because if you're interested in the term, but again, how do you explain bishops and abbots going to war with their own contingents historically and throughout all the Carolingian era in documented fashion? Again, I know that you're trying to pin the term, the vasellatic vocabulary in some fixed fashion. That's not how you will find it in the sources. That's absolutely normal. That was never a problem to begin with. And if somebody went harder with the definition at some point in a more categorical way, it's on him. It wasn't a generalized misconception that we need to find these examples to pretend to debunk. All right. They also say this: the idea that officials such as bishops, counts, and dukes were bound to the king as vassals is one formed on a foundation of sand. How much they like these expressions. How exactly? I bet that the audience of people who watch this are mostly Americans who are eager to say that Europe is a vassal of the United States, but if they don't find the term vassal in the relation between these guys, they will say, oh, no, it's wrong. There wasn't a feudal system here, it's something else. again, it's completely normal to have clientelar relations between all these figures. We said it before, public offices ended up being privatized. That's the hallmark of Frankish identity, socially, culturally. They didn't know the difference between public and private, all right? If you know Frankish history, this is what they fundamentally were about. I made an entire video that is titled The Private Nature of Carolingian Frankish Public Authorities. What was one of my first videos on Schwerpunkt. This is like the ABC of France at the time, right? Again, what do we mean by vassalic relation at this point? Were bishops, counts, and dukes subjected to kings and emperors? Yes. Did they follow him in war? Largely, yes. Some also could escape that if they wanted to be more autonomous or to rebel. But was there this kind of hierarchy? Was there a general sense of clientelar connection? Yes. Most of these people were still actually appointed by the sovereign. So the mere fact of choosing somebody over somebody else and receiving all that kind of public and private power at the time was, I think, pretty rewarding and indebting at the same time towards authority. That's how, again, the system kept working later as well. You cannot separate. You see, here it's falling in the same mistake of presuming that there was essentially a different mechanism between sort of the earlier and later feudalism. It's just the development of the same clientelar relationships, just by different proportions, like ratios of power, right? And some gradual institutionalization and juridical recognition of the same. But again, it began somewhere. It wasn't even in the Carolingian era. So no, there was none of that. It was literally the same thing. All right. That's why, as you said before, you find these terms also in the 6th century. And while not generalized, were still concepts that survive across all these era in a system that we know pretty well working on the basis of, again, installation in these offices of power, mostly controlling some land and the people working on them, for having some kind of military retinues ready for the king to use. The entire Carolingian system was a huge logistical hub, right? There were magazines for the fodrum, for the army supplies everywhere. Most of the system orbited around this. The possibility of the system to cyclically send waves of armies to conquer here and there and taming rebellions was based on this mechanism. It's the single biggest feature of the Carolingian Empire. That's why Rome was literally reactivated, also in a formal sense, in the West at this point, in the person of Charlemagne, right? These are important things. It's not some kind of abstract, systemicistic explanation that at some point people made up for some strange reason. Feudal Europe is pretty consistent with all what we mostly picture it like, aside from this specific necessity of saying, okay, well, here we must find the term vassus or beneficium, otherwise it's not a vassalic system. So literally, if it was the same thing or something around there, but with a different terminology, and we're lucky at this point to find anything for most places in terms of actual documentation, doesn't it? Didn't the word work the way it did at the time? This is a bit too much, right? And then they come up with the notion that there is a newer research that basically states that feudalism was actually created in the 12th and the 13th centuries. Mostly, how do they intend this? Because essentially in feudal monarchies, there were even more powerful clients that controlled, by the way, at this point, also sub-clients in much more straightforwardly documentable way. And so these offices and titles were more recognized also along some kind of feudal law that was actually codified at that point. Obviously, in order to codify feudal law, this must have existed already in the dynamics. We know it pretty well. We know how, again, in 10th century Gaul, maybe the written arrangement was not even necessary between in a public context, even vocal oaths were enough in front of the community, and there was a usage that was recognized as a custom, also legally, etc. Right? So they also say bishops, counts, and dukes were not bound to the king as vassals by hierarchical structure or fiefs, but by other means of loyalty, trust, and consensus within the elite. Excuse me, if I give you a beneficium, what other means exists other than loyalty, trust, and consensus within the elite for bonding with the king? Right? I mean, truly. And the system did work for a while. Again, the Carolingian Empire was a point in which this worked for some generation, bringing to a hell of a power being enacted. Again, I give you a piece of land. It's not because I give you a piece of land that you automatically owe me something afterwards. At least I can ask you, but you can at that point be as powerful as the beneficium that I gave you and doing whatever you want, which is exactly what happens later. And paradoxically, it's from the sublimation of this feudal system that a more powerful feudal monarchy emerges and is able to gradually co-opt all these other vassals into a more recognizable, recognizably documentable institutional system, right? So they point also what Roman Deutinger said. It was a German historian that said there was no sub-vassal in the sources of the Frankish Empire of the 8th and the 9th centuries. Now, to claim that across all of Transalpine Europe there was not a vassal who subcontracted in his own way somebody else for working later seems to me pretty weird, right? It's not like if you don't find that evidence, the work did not work by simply subcontracting things. I mean, we subcontract things even today without a feudal system. This happened continuously. It's a sort of obvious societal juridical issue. You didn't find anything of that. Is it important? We know, for example, that there were people who could send to war others in their stead. They did that. They had to send, if you had that amount of land, you had to send somebody to make war. And sometimes it was not the same people who owned the land. So isn't that a form of sub-vassalization, if you want? Once you actually entrust this person even with an armament, with an equipment, is someone who leaves off of somebody else's means often, or maybe their own, but still under somebody. Right, north of the Alps, most people are somebody else's people. Always remember that, right? This is a particularly distinctive figure. Think about the ministeriales. Again, they are technically not vassals because they're technically serfs. They're not freemen, but isn't it literally, in some ways, the same thing? Isn't there even a parallel form of infeudation in parallel to the most straightforward freemen's fiefs? There is all a complexity in that. Again, I'm not claiming myself that it was a vassalic order that everybody abided by. This didn't work, right? And it's obvious, as kings and generals say, that there was a very shaded reality. But the thing that things are shaded and diverse, however they like to use this term, does not mean that there isn't a straightforward bottom line to it that is how the system straightforwardly worked pretty much across the entire this case Europe, post-Carolingian Europe, right? So they say the concept of feudalism is unable to capture this. Why? This is a mere conventional definition. Why is feudalism unable to capture the fact that there was somebody who subcontracted some land or recognized that as a fait accompli and that started building some seigneurial power on top of that? That's literally what starts happening. Admittedly, mostly from the 10th century, but again, already before you find something like that. If anything, before the system was less stratified. And so it's obviously not as fully fledged and institutionalized and formalized as in the later Middle Ages, but this is also kind of obvious. The society was much simpler and more primitive. So they quote Deutinger says, a system that allows a myriad of exceptions and can only be proven in a few individual cases, is no longer a system but simply a fiction. Again, if you pretend that a system is just a nominalistic concept applied to the vocabulary used, aside from any connection with reality, politically, military, or socially, well, you can believe it's fiction. Yeah, it's exactly what a conventional term means. And this doesn't mean, again, that you can't use the term Byzantine or the term feudalism to capture exactly what that society was also pretty notoriously about, and in relatively as straightforwardly similar fashions, especially, again, in post-Carolingian Europe. That is also very well outlined when you compare it to, to the Anglo-Saxons that also had some tendencies of that kind anyway, or the Danes, or the Magyars, or even the Saracens, right? So, again, what are we even talking about, right? Why do we need this thing of destroying everything? For which purpose? Do you have to explain history, or do you have to debunk myths, myth-bust things to make yourself feel better about it? Not asking K&J makers, but in general people, scholars that seem to enjoy this idea of deconstructing, because, you have to break the schemes. When you actually learn stuff, you can deconstruct literally everything, even geometry. Point, line, and plan are complete fiction. So do we eliminate our understanding of physics as far as it's useful to us because of the world of space, etc., because it's a convention? Only in the 90s, we were at the peak of religion, morality, tradition, ideals, I would say, and some kind of greater sense of unity that, by the way, this system was obsessed with at the time. That's also why they maintain an empire, this terribly diverse system that, however, literally believed all the same things, by the way, inexplicably, according to these people, because, of course, study socioeconomics and don't study history of religion. Yeah, sure, it's going to be very, or warfare for that matter, and how armies worked at the time across Europe. Yeah, that's exactly how you will learn history. Unfortunately, again, hyper-specialization has severed the leg to human dignity at some important level. So they make the statement that allegedly after Reynolds, because before, of course, everybody believed this, they literally say, quote, "The image of Carolingian rule today is therefore less one of a centralized empire." A centralized empire? Can you find any medievalist anywhere that ever thought that the Carolingian Empire was a centralized empire? Is this a joke? And this would invalidate the concept of feudalism, So I reread it. Today, the image of Carolingian Europe is therefore less of a centralized empire with the system of feudalism as its dominating structure at its core. And here I understand the strawman point, because, again, the argument is that everything worked with the vasus and the beneficium, right? I understand how people sort of may think that nominalistically they wouldn't find actually this system explicitated by the terminology of the sources. But again, all these systems, you said it before yourself, were clientelar systems. The Roman one, the migration in the Germanic one of the origin, they were all clientelar systems. They all worked through a contract. I give you something, you give me something, right? So you can't call it senior vasus beneficium as the contractors and the object of transaction, at least from one of the sides. It's literally what the definition of contract is. It doesn't matter how you call it, all right? Is this the actual thing? All right. And so they add on this that he said everything was flexible. And so what does this change? Like, every contract had to be the same. This must be, you see, if you're going to make a point, it must follow some logic that is not self-defying, right? And what is in a contract that goes beyond the duality of a lord and a vassal, right? If I make a contract with someone, there are two parties or even multiple parties involved, as it happened, by the way, in the vassalatic beneficiary system. There are many examples of seigneuries that shared a different place, for example. Again, I talked plenty of this in my videos about the seigneurial era, so it's somehow embarrassing to a point to read this stuff. And by the way, they come up with this notion, therefore the birthplace and time of feudalism as a system in Europe lies elsewhere. All right, so here they make the point that basically feudalism was born. They put it in this way. They don't mean it literally, but again, the way it's phrased, it's too bad, right? Because they literally say the birthplace and time of feudalism as a system in Europe lies not in the most straightforwardly vassalatic, privatistic, elite, clientelary system in the entire continent, that is the great Atlantic plains dominated by the Franks, but it lies in northern Italy in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, right? Aside from the fact that these are the exact generations in which the consular commune happens, so in theory, that was the moment of greatest crisis of feudalism in Italy, particularly northern Italy, and we made lots of videos about that. But basically, they make the point that since Roman law was being revived, in many ways they were again legal stuff being studied. They even make a mistake here when they claim that Roman law codes had remained in partial legal use in Italy long after the fall of the Roman Empire. This is actually one of the single most contentious, or notoriously contentious and unverifiable statements in the history of law, of medieval law. The Corpus Juris Civilis is attributed not to have actually circulated in Italy at all, even after it was issued by the pragmatic sanction by Justinian in the peninsula. So much so that in this moment, the Italians were resuming the Corpus Juris Civilis that they had literally to reconstruct through manuscripts coming from the Byzantine Empire, not from Italy. In all of this, when Longobard law, especially there, but also Frankish law, the various capitularies, the kingly constitutions, and feudal customs mostly, had already constituted the juridical system that necessitated of some sort of firmer, more statal-like oriented law like the Roman one. Was not even resumed as now we will substitute all what we have here with the Roman one. It's not how it took centuries for even being conceived as an idea. And what they were doing, of course, like this is a moment of fierce juridical recovery and production. I made lots of videos on the topic as well, obviously enough. Of course, the feudal constitutions are being explored because they were, first of all, part of the actual juridical system. There were actual books of feudal law already at the time. All right. If you are subordinating this to Roman law, right, that stuff already existed, right? And again, it's not even like, public authority was not recognized. There are the capitularies, the king's laws, the imperial laws that also deal with, surprise, surprise, the beneficia. One of the greatest works in the history of feudal law, Conrad de Salien's Edictum de Beneficiis, also known as Constitutio de Feudis, 1037. All right. This is not even 200 years after Louis the Pious' reign. All right. Edictum de Beneficiis, Constitutio de Feudis. This is the Holy Roman Emperor. This is issued for the Italic kingdom by him. It was eventually to spread also in the various parts of, post-Carolingian Europe in the various reigns. Beneficium and the term fief was really not there, right? How do we go from here? I mean, seriously, right? So, no, it was invented in the late 11th century and the early 12th centuries by the Italian jurists that surely were quite active in everything. But, guys, you cannot give this kind of information to people, right? And I don't know whether Reynolds specifically I don't know, was just rolling the dice, and other people agree. There is no, because my interpretation of this is that whoever wrote the script may have not actually gotten what even the single scholars were actually telling. It's straightforwardly, conventional knowledge that the feudal constitutions are born more or less at that point because they were written down, they were codified in ways that were handed down to us and further used in the centuries afterwards, all right? Does this mean that before there weren't feudal laws? Right? This is not a thing. We know very well that world. We know very well the sources. This is not an obscure blob where nobody understands what's happening. We have a pretty solid understanding of how this worked on a legal basis. It's in a very complex world. And yes, feudal laws were there. And that's why they began to codify them in a world that had not quite necessitated of that. And that, absolutely, I share King's and General's point that this writing down enhanced the feudal system in a broader juridical and institutional sense. There is no doubt. It became a point of reference. That's what they had written it for. But what is it created at this point? Evidently not. All right? The terminology at least was there already. Was pretty mainstream, was pretty, I hate the term mainstream, but pretty conventional, public, understandable. Consider that law. Also, I studied legal texts of these eras, and they're very straightforward. Laws are very clear. They must clarify their own same content, all right? They have to work very straightforwardly. Pretending that broader planetary relations and hierarchies did not exist at this point, and that, a power bestowed on a duke was not feudal in the sense that at least the terminology was not used, but that it didn't actually signify that kind of broader investiture, is pretty misleading. I think it's very confusing for any student, and that's why we came up with the concept of feudalism in a more straightforward sense. You don't like that, again, we use a term that doesn't find too much echo, at least in every source, as if everything had to be a totalitarian state where everybody used the same sources. Well, I'm sorry, this is the high Middle Ages. That's not how things were supposed to work to begin with, all right? So, and here it talks also about all the whole, how all these feudal laws were codified. And again, it's pretty, I also made a video on Schwerpunkt. I can't search here. Schwerpunkt, I don't remember whether I made a video about feudal law at some point. I made a video about medieval sovereigns. So there is something. I haven't created a medieval law playlist yet, but again, we will, if anything, I will create one, maybe not today, in the next days. KNG states this. Legal scholars at this point attempted to make a strong connection between fiefs and vassalage. Oh yes, because, I just give fiefs randomly. I'm Charlemagne, I'm running across, some Gallic road and I throw fiefs grants at people for no reason. Obviously, if I give you something, this is about some big deal. Mostly we're talking land here, all right? Even if there were money fiefs and different forms of, again, exchange, especially in certain areas of Europe, you don't throw that away without any kind of connection. We were those people who could afford this. Of course, at the lower level, because the point that I make is that, the peasant level, we don't even have the documentation for that. It's obvious, right? So the notion that in the 1930s and 40s, they were just looking at the military side of the story, well, because the military side of the story was the elite one, that's because it's the most straightforwardly documented and sort of self-evident in and of itself, because there were some cultural practices behind this oath of allegiance since millennia. We haven't emphasized this too much, but this oath of allegiance existed since ever. You got stuff in exchange. Look at my videos about the Germanic Gefolgschaft. This is pretty notorious. It happened everywhere. It happened in the steppe. It happened, again, this is so notorious anthropologically, socially, sociologically, politologically, at every level, this is how the entire world worked. And in a sense, we still work like this, all right? We also have here clienteles. We exchange stuff with one another. So again, how you call it is not so important. I found people that say that we live in a big feudal system nowadays. Is it correct? Is it incorrect? You know, if you are a person in some culture, you know how you can use the term in the specific, in the appropriate context where it makes sense. Because again, this is not a chimera. This is not a fantasy or a made-up idea, right? So again, who wrote this last phrase, for example, was a bit maybe lost in the Hyperuranium a little bit. There is no doubt that every place had its own workings, by the way, but you say here 11th, 12th century. Made lots of videos about 12th century German ministeriales. We've seen how complex contracts were between the ministeriales and their masters. And those were, at the time, were evenly written down. Even in a country like Germany, it was not overwhelmingly advanced at that point, but that had a lot of vassalic beneficiary connections. Again, you can call them how you want. There were so many different relations. Yes, and the contracts varied, but what was the point? Did it change the fact that there was a class of servant knights in Germany that were actual feudal knights in a conventional sense, technically, for example, in a military sense, but they weren't feudal because, again, they were servants and didn't have thieves as freemen, but they still controlled them, and in fact, they were the same power of freemen, and that's actually why we talk about the ministeriales. We find so many different regulations, and at the end of the day, that estate was homogeneous in its condition. So wasn't that part of a broader feudal system? Yes, it was a German way to it. But again, you call it in a different way. You attribute these people different rights. Aren't they milites fighting for their lords in the typical knightly fashion of the year? You see, you can change the colors, but the car remains the same. That's why you shouldn't be fooled by this notion that since things have different names, no, it's too complicated, you can't use a term that embraces all. Why not? That's exactly why we use that term, because it works. Not because there is a confusion about it, because it refers to a very specific thing. That's why we don't compare apples to oranges, and there isn't a broader way to compare apples and oranges other than being part of the broader fruit system in a way. Umbrella, and if we found something more similar between one another, we would be sort of maybe making equations between those, or at least saying they're very similar with one another. All right? It's just like, I don't know, a dog and a wolf are similar. And here it's even more straightforward to that, right? And so you can't erase the fact that they have a lot in common in a factually scientific way. This is all the same for the political, military, and social system of high medieval Europe, right? So they basically argue that, again, especially in the 12th and the 13th century, the dissemination of the aforementioned codified feudal law reinforces the broader system of this practice, and so it becomes more straightforward, and everything is written down, etc. And Reynolds says that in the Renaissance, lawyers and historians look at these texts and they start thinking that the Middle Ages as a whole reasoned along that pattern. This is also relatively conspiratorially sounding, meaning that it's not like in the 16th century they didn't know that there had been a sequence of rulers and different texts in different times. Yes, it was a more rudimentary and primitive system, and they cared less than we do. But to presume that the idea of feudalism was a scam, especially, again, in the 20th century when we studied, generally speaking, these texts in general, and something could be more or less still to further develop in some more acceptable historiographical term for today's standards, yes, but was there a consensus that, I don't know, in the time of Charlemagne there was a centralized system, as you literally said in the screen in the video, and that everything worked on the basis of that terminology? there's never been a historian who suggested this. All right, that's not even in the realm of reality. A mentally sane person is not able to conceive a level of societal uniformity or unified thinking that would bring to something like that with the means of the time. It's just insane. Nobody ever stated that, right? Somebody heading toward that direction to provide with a pattern, with a model, may have indulged in a simplification, but not in the literal statement. This was the case, right? So basically, that's how the video goes. They say that things went on in the 19th century to formulate the idea of the Middle Ages based on this feudal concept. And again, to an extent, it is also true that feudal law, as it was codified historically in the later Middle Ages, did influence eventually the documentability of the same and the research on that. But it's like, I don't know, heraldry. I made multiple videos about the archetypal meaning of symbols, of this proto-heraldry. Heraldry is properly speaking a modern discipline, not a medieval one. Does it mean that there wasn't a heraldic, or in this sense, from a purely modern conventional terminological perspective, a proto-heraldic meaning to knights' distinction, means of distinction? There was a universe of that before it. It's very modernistic to presume that since we ourselves use a term, we're simply entailing something categorical that we should tell the other not to use in order to shut up. Like, there are people who are surely going to take this video by saying if you use the term feudalism, you're basically incompetent, you don't know anything. But it's full of people like this on the internet. The only purpose of them is a sort of smearing authority, because they cannot afford to accept that knowing history and the world and reality is not about, again, citing somebody that you still do by authority at the end of the day, but actually understanding things and knowing how they worked. All right. Again, so this video does not actually explain how eventually the same system factually worked. I'm sure that kings and generals have some videos that describe feudal militias, training, etc., in ways that quite concretely and graphically illustrate how the system actually worked. One of these systems one of these videos I remember was Kings and Generals during Victor St. Roman. They showed how the Byzantine recruitment system worked in the High Middle Ages. Basically, it was identical, just by a different degree within the same, but in the foundations, identical to the West. And yeah, it kind of was. Because guess what? Societies were incredibly similar, and so throwing around this notion that everything was different, and so you can't apply the notion of feudalism as we conventionally use it to the system is wrong. What's the point, right? This is just, again, debunking misconceptions. We'll stay tuned for, or subscribe if you want to hear about the most common misconception. What kind of misconceptions have we debunked about this? I mean, seriously. Right. It's a huge issue, and I don't know how. And I'll skip the conclusions here and all the rest. And everything works around the concept that Reynolds saved the world by telling us how feudalism really was, because everybody was too stupid to understand it before. Well, thank you. We will be. I doubt also that that's what Reynolds' intention actually was. But unfortunately, a bit there is this sensationalistic selling attitude in some parts of the academia that is completely alien, especially to the academia I come from. We don't see scholars as saints or miracle makers, or we actually tend to read the sources, which is indeed what Reynolds did too. It's not to say that her principles were again faulty or whatever, but again, that's not what you can simply come to define a single work. Because if Reynolds had actually written a text in which it debunked basically an alleged misconception that everybody had fallen into, at this point, it would have been maybe the greatest object of controversy of the entire, historiography, right? How could it have been? That's not what happened. That's not, essentially, they explain it themselves in KNG. They say it in just one phrase, but basically Reynolds was mostly checking terminology. All right, and obviously it's not like the previous understanding of feudalism was based solely on terminology. As I said before, if you know how feudal warfare, in fact, worked, say, in the 11th century, or in the 10th, there isn't much room for whatever term they used. All right, there are some things that you can sort of pick more concretely here and there to actually be proper or not, but it remains a secondary aspect to the whole picture. That's why I don't like people who also say, okay, you must watch this video because it debunks the most common misconceptions. Again, I could make a video about the debunking of our understanding of feudalism when it's forced in some direction, and this is, by the way, just kings and generals' way to doubt. I mean, they decided to stick to the terminology and to some sort of extremized notion how we allegedly would have believed feudalism had been born, which I've never heard like in my entire academic experience, and in part also because I worked on updated text, but like there's also this Reynolds thing, again, was, if anything, irrelevant to the type of understanding they already had of feudalism that is notoriously also, I don't think it's more advanced than many other 20th century scholars that published excellent works before Reynolds in 1994, and that understood, as I said at the beginning, pretty darn well what feudalism was about. I dislike the term feudalism. Myself, I'm aware that it's object of a controversy, but it's like, again, I said it before, the apologetic heresy. We are essentially not teaching history. We're telling people how to be more justified in their paranoia towards authority and effort, hard work, actual research, historical method, coping with complexity. The average person today is scared of coping with complexity. They essentially clothe complexity with the notion that if it is complex, you can't say what it is because it's too complex, man. When the only way to understand the world and doing anything about it is going into it and gradually understanding it through hard work and actual experience. And I can say, even as a historian, by writing and researching and making these videos as well, you come to learn ever more. It becomes ever simpler to understand. And so overly complications and over distinctions, over diversification is not how you recognize historical quality. It's the other way around, which doesn't mean to create some relativistic or absolutistic, which are actually the same thing, imaginary realities to put a patch on it and not come with the reality. It literally means feudalism can be so straightforwardly explained in ways that all make sense in all the fields that we are aware of. And even if it remains a conventional terms, it speaks of something complex enough but coherent enough that you can browse, you can understand, you can research. This is it. And again, it's plenty of actual texts and works on feudalism. And it's not that they're lying to you because they use the term. Just like Byzantine or whatever, it's sort of slightly different thing, but to make, I don't know, like this entire video passing as the, again, it's the one of the most common misconceptions. We will make more serious about the common misconceptions. Well, I hope that these are going to be better videos and better debunking or whatever, because we always have this kind of the myth that because, it's not really how you've been told, because now I will explain it to you even if you don't know anything about that. That's basically how it unfolds. And again, if you want to learn history well, you must make history well. And you must get into it. Again, in 19 minutes, you can't explain this stuff. And you obviously sort of box yourself into finding a way out that is shorter than it should be. These are the actual results. And again, I think I made my point. If anything, you can, as I said before, check my seigneurial history playlist, which is pretty pretty hefty. Also, the post-Carolingian Europe one is pretty consistent. I haven't made too many videos. Here I see 30, I think. No, 21 on the seigneurial system. And especially like if you have the post-Carolingian Europe, that is big, and it's one of my favorite content. That expands on so many things. Accipe gladium ad defendendum castra deis, words and dubbing in the Carolingian and Ottonian tradition. Check that out. That gives you a linearity in how these people thought that makes you realize that the world revolved around this entire system. The feature of feudalism, in many ways, it's basically about this. It's not about denying the complexity of the system. The Frankish feudalism did not choke the system. It allowed communes to prosper. It allowed so much complexity to occur. But yes, it was still a traditionally hierarchical system. You cannot read a primitive corporative system as some kind of hyper differing and ever-changing one, where, for the sake of example, within a plateau range of stuff, you can say, well, it varies on the basis of this plateau, and then what about the plateau? If you don't explain that, you're just confusing people. And unfortunately, that's also how many scholars behave nowadays. But this post-Carolingian Europe 60 videos, that's actually pretty consistent, and it shows a lot of what we were talking about before. So I'm glad I made this video. I know that there are lots of people who are probably going to watch this just because it's kings and generals, and that's in a sense despicable, meaning that if you really want to know things, channels like mine are obviously the best. People just are in for the drama most of the times, and they think that a video like this is just more important than, I don't know, the ones I made the days before. They receive less views. I already know how people behave. Herd behavior is quite disturbing in many ways, but especially when you realize that there is a faulty mechanism at the root of the decision. But this is unfortunately the world that we live in, right? So if we want to make things seriously, let's make things seriously. Otherwise, I don't know what to say. Very well, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.